He was 16 years old the winter they nailed his family's door shut, and he stood in the frozen mud of the Ransom farmyard holding nothing but a canvas sack, $7 sewn into the lining of his coat, and a grief so heavy it had no bottom. That winter, in the small lake town of Sable Hollow, Minnesota, they auctioned off an old abandoned ice house down by the shore, a leaning, frost-blackened building nobody had touched in 15 years, its roof caved with rot, its name whispered by mothers as a warning to children who wandered too close to the water. The men at the auction laughed when the boy raised his hand and offered $6 for the whole crumbling structure and the half-acre of frozen ground beneath it. They called it charity, not commerce, and told him he'd bought himself a grave marker for his foolishness. What none of them knew, what not one soul left living in Sable Hollow understood, was that beneath the packed sawdust and the black, ancient ice still lodged in that building's belly lay something that had been waiting 15 winters to be found, something that would not only change the course of one orphan boy's life, but would tear open a wound the whole town had learned to live with, and finally let it heal. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Eli Ransom. Before we begin, we'd be grateful if you'd take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel, so more stories like Eli's can find their way to you. Eli Ransom had been born in the spring of 1873 on 80 acres of black Minnesota soil. His father Thomas had broken with a borrowed team and a stubbornness that ran in the family like a second bloodline. His mother, Mary, kept a garden so orderly that women from 3 farms over came to ask her secrets, though she never had any beyond patience and a willingness to kneel in the dirt until her knees ached. The Ransoms were not wealthy people. They were, in the particular economy of that place and time, something better. They were trusted. Thomas Ransom's word on a debt was worth more than another man's signature, and when the Hollow's little Lutheran church needed its roof mended, or a widow needed her firewood split before the first snow, it was understood without anyone saying so that Thomas would be there, sleeves rolled, breath fogging in the cold, asking for nothing in return. It was from his father that Eli learned the quiet arithmetic of decency, that a debt of kindness paid without witnesses was worth 10 paid in public. And it was from his mother that he learned patience, the long, unglamorous kind that has nothing to do with waiting for good fortune and everything to do with tending something faithfully long before it shows any sign of reward. She taught him to read using a single worn Bible and a stack of almanacs, tracing letters into flowers spilled on the table when paper was too dear to waste. She taught him, too, a peculiar fondness for the lake, not for fishing, though he did that well enough, but for the ice itself. Old Thomas had cut ice on Sable Lake as a young man, back when the ice house by the shore had still stood proud and full, its walls packed with sawdust insulation and its underground chambers holding blocks of lake ice clear as glass clean through July. He used to take Eli down to the frozen shoreline on winter mornings and show him how to read the ice, the way its color told you its age, the way a milky vein meant a weak spot, the way the lake groaned at night, like something breathing beneath a blanket. Ice remembers, his father used to say, tapping a boot against a frozen puddle. It holds on to whatever falls into it, and keeps it safe till somebody comes looking. Eli had thought it only a saying, the kind of thing fathers told sons to fill a quiet walk home. He did not yet know how literally true it would prove to be. The Ransoms were not the richest family along the lake road, but they were, by every account, among the most content, and it was that contentment, that sense of a life built slowly and honestly, that made what followed so difficult for the town to watch. In the autumn of 1888, when Eli was 15, a low fever moved through Sable Hollow the way fevers did in those years, arriving quietly on the coattails of a traveling grain buyer and settling first into the lungs of the very old and the very young. Mary Ransom fell ill in October. Thomas nursed her through November, sleeping in a chair beside their bed, refusing every offer of help because he could not bear to be a burden even in his wife's dying. By the second week of December, Eli was an orphan, and the 80 acres his father had broken with his own 2 hands stood mortgaged to the Sable Hollow Trust and Land Company for a debt Eli hadn't known existed, a debt his father had quietly taken on 2 winters before to help bury 3 other families' losses after a bad crop year. and had been paying down in secret ever since, never telling his wife or his son, because that was simply the kind of man Thomas Ransom was. The banker who held that mortgage was a narrow, precise man named Silas Grigg, who wore his integrity the way other men wore their Sunday coats, visibly, and only on the days it was convenient. Grigg had come to Sable Hollow 11 years earlier as a stranger with capital and a talent for arithmetic, and in that time he had made himself indispensable to a town that did not yet understand what indispensability, in a banker, could cost. He called on Eli not 2 weeks after the funeral, sitting in the Ransom kitchen with his hat in his lap and an expression of manufactured sorrow, and explained, in the gentle voice of a man delivering very bad news very kindly, that the estate could not cover the debt, that the bank had been patient long enough, and that the boy, for he was, after all, only a boy, not yet 16, would need to vacate the property by the new year. He said he was sorry. He said it twice. Eli would remember, for the rest of his life, that Grigg's boots had been polished to a mirror shine, and that he had not once looked at him while he spoke, choosing instead to study the grain of the table his father had built. There was no aunt to take him in, no uncle within 3 counties, no cousin willing to feed another mouth in a hard year. The church took up a small collection, more out of duty than warmth, and it was that collection, added to what little his father had managed to hide away in a tin behind a loose board, $7 in worn coin, that Eli carried with him the January morning he walked away from the only home he had ever known, down the frozen lake road, into a town that regarded him with the particular pity reserved for those whose misfortune makes everyone else quietly grateful for their own good luck. He took a room, if it could be called that, in the loft above Kestrel's blacksmith shop, in exchange for sweeping and hauling coal, and it was old Abel Kestrel, a wide, soot-stained man with a laugh like a door hinge and a soft spot for strays of every kind, who first told him about the Icehouse. It sat at the north end of the lakeshore, half a mile past the last of the fishing shacks, and it had not been used since 1874, the year old Corliss Wexford disappeared. Wexford had once been the most trusted man in Sable Hollow, the Ice King, they'd called him, half in jest and half in genuine respect, because it was Wexford's business that kept the whole town in cold storage through the brutal Minnesota summers, and Wexford's generosity that had, 3 years running, personally financed the collection for a proper schoolhouse to replace the one-room shack the children had been squeezed into since the town's founding. Then, one February night, Corliss Wexford simply vanished. His rowboat was found capsized near the ice-cutting grounds 2 days later, and the town concluded, with the particular cruelty of communities that need someone to blame, that he had drowned trying to flee with the schoolhouse fund he'd been safekeeping. Nearly $400, an enormous sum for that place and time. No body was ever recovered. The Icehouse was shuttered, the schoolhouse plans abandoned, and Corliss Wexford's name became, in the years since, a byword for betrayal, a story mothers told to explain why the town had never gotten its proper school, why the little clapboard shack still leaked when it rained. It was Abel Kestrel who mentioned, almost as an afterthought while banking the forge fire one evening, that the county was finally auctioning off the old Icehouse and its lot for unpaid taxes, since no living relative of Wexford's had ever been found to claim it. Nobody in their right mind will bid on it, Abel said, not unkindly. Roof's half gone. Ground's probably still cursed, if you believe what folks say. Eli said nothing that night, but something in him, some inheritance of his father's stubborn faith in overlooked things, turned the idea over and over until it would not let him sleep. The auction was held on a bitter Saturday in late January, on the courthouse steps, with maybe a dozen men gathered more for the entertainment than any genuine interest, stamping their feet against the cold and passing a flask that nobody bothered to hide from the sheriff. When the auctioneer called the Icehouse lot, there was a ripple of laughter before anyone even spoke, the kind of laughter that already knows the punchline. Silas Grigg himself was there, arms folded inside his fine wool coat, watching with the mild amusement of a man who owns most of what matters in a town and has no need to bid on what doesn't. When Eli Ransom, 16 years old and still gaunt with grief, stepped forward and offered $6, the laughter turned pointed. Someone called out that the boy ought to save his money for a proper coat. Someone else said the ice inside that building had probably turned to poison by now. Grigg said nothing at all, only watched Eli with an expression that might, in a kinderman, have passed for curiosity, but in Grigg looked more like a man filing away a fact for later use. The auctioneer, more out of boredom than ceremony, banged his gavel and pronounced the sale final, and just like that, Eli Ransom owned a ruin. He walked out to see it the next morning, alone, the wind coming hard off the frozen lake and cutting through his father's old coat, which he had taken to wearing though it hung loose on his still-growing frame. The Icehouse stood exactly as bad as its reputation. A long, low building of thick timber walls, built deliberately without windows to hold the cold, its roof sagging under years of unshoveled snow, its double doors frozen half open on rusted hinges so that drifts had piled inside against the near wall. The air that came out to meet him when he pushed the doors wider smelled of sawdust and cold stone and something else beneath it, something mineral and old, like the inside of a well. He stood in the doorway a long moment, $7 poorer, homeless, and entirely uncertain that he had done anything but throw away the last of what his father had left him. Then he stepped inside anyway, because it was his, and because there was, he found, a strange comfort in owning something, however broken, that no one could take from him twice. The floor of the Icehouse was not dirt, as he'd expected, but a deep pit, perhaps 8 feet down, lined with fieldstone and packed, even after all these years, with a dense, matted layer of sawdust that had preserved, in the building's coldest corner, a stubborn shelf of old lake ice, gray, granular, half-melted and refrozen 100 times over, but ice nonetheless, 15 winters old, clinging to the bottom of the pit like a secret the building had refused to give up. Eli climbed down a rickety ladder someone, long ago, had left leaning against the pit wall, and knelt in the cold gloom, running his gloved hand over the strange, ancient ice, remembering his father's voice. Ice remembers. It holds on to whatever falls into it, and keeps it safe till somebody comes looking. He spent that first week doing what any sensible young man in his position would do, patching the roof with scrap tin borrowed against future labor from Abel Kestrel, sweeping out drifted snow, making the loft space at the building's south end barely livable with a small stovepipe punched through the wall. It was on the 9th day, while clearing the last of the old sawdust from the pit's northern corner to check the fieldstone for cracks, that his shovel struck something that was not stone. It gave a hollow, wooden sound, and his heart, for reasons he could not yet explain, began to beat harder than the cold alone could account for. He dug carefully after that, using his hands more than the shovel, and uncovered, over the better part of an hour, the corner of a trapdoor set flush into the pit's stone floor, its iron ring rusted nearly solid, its wood swollen tight with 15 years of damp. It took him another 2 days, working each evening by lantern light after his chores at Kestrel's forge, to free the hinges enough to lift it, and when he finally did, hauling upward with both hands and the sheer stubbornness his father had bred into him. What he found beneath was not another chamber of ice, as he had half expected, but a narrow stone cellar, dry as a bone despite the pit's dampness above it, built, he would later understand, deliberately, cunningly, by a man who had known exactly how to hide something from a town that trusted him too completely to ever think to look. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth gone stiff with age, he found a strongbox, and beside it, a leather satchel containing a thick, water-stained ledger and a bundle of letters tied with cord. His hands shook as he lifted the strongbox into the lantern light, not from cold, though the cold was considerable, but from a feeling he could not name, a sense that he had stumbled into the middle of a story that did not belong to him, but was about to become his whether he wished it or not. The strongbox was locked, and it would take Abel Kestrel's tools and 2 more days before Eli worked the old mechanism free, but the ledger he could open at once, and what he read there, by lantern light, alone in a stone cellar beneath 15 winters of forgotten ice, would occupy him until dawn. The ledger belonged to Corliss Wexford, and it was, page after careful page, an accounting of the schoolhouse fund, every dollar of the nearly 400 the town believed he had stolen and drowned with, recorded in a meticulous, almost loving hand, alongside notes that told a very different story than the one Sable Hollow had settled into over 15 years. Wexford had not been fleeing with the money. He had been protecting it. The final entries, dated the very week of his disappearance, described his growing alarm at the conduct of a newly arrived banker named Silas Grigg, who had approached Wexford privately and suggested, with the smooth confidence of a man used to being obeyed, that the schoolhouse fund be deposited into the new Sable Hollow Trust for safekeeping and interest, an offer Wexford had refused, in writing, stating plainly that he did not trust a man who had been in town 8 months and already controlled half its debts. Grigg had not taken the refusal well. Wexford's last entry, written in a hand grown noticeably unsteady, recorded that he had been followed twice on the ice-cutting road, that he feared for the fund's safety, and that he had resolved to hide it somewhere no one, not even his own family, would think to look until the town selectmen could be gathered to receive it properly. He had built the hidden cellar himself, alone, over 2 winters, beneath the one place in Sable Hollow no thief would ever think to dig, under the ice itself, in a building everyone assumed held nothing but frozen water. 2 nights after that final entry, Corliss Wexford's boat was found capsized, and Corliss Wexford was never seen again. Eli sat with that ledger until the lantern burned low, understanding, with a slow and terrible clarity, that the whole town's memory of a thief was built on a silence 15 years deep, and that the man most likely to have wanted that silence, the man who had gained more from Sable Hollow's collapsed trust in its own generosity than anyone else alive, was Silas Grigg, who now sat as the town's most respected banker, who had, in the years since, foreclosed on no fewer than 6 farms along the Lake Road, including, Eli now understood with a chill that had nothing to do with the seller's cold, the very mortgage that had taken his own father's land. He did not act rashly. That, too, was his father in him. He spent the following weeks quietly, continuing his work at Kestrel's forge by day and returning each evening to the Icehouse, where he worked the strongbox open at last with Abel's tools and found inside it, wrapped in wax paper gone brittle with age, the remaining balance of the schoolhouse fund itself, gold and silver coin, preserved dry and untouched in that stone cellar for 15 years, protected, in a strange way his father would have appreciated, by the very ice that had made the building nearly worthless to anyone who didn't understand what lay beneath it. He told only Abel Kestrel at first, swearing him to silence, and the old blacksmith sat with the ledger open on his knee for a long while, saying nothing, his jaw working, before he finally spoke Corliss Wexford's name with something like grief. "I called that man a thief for 15 years, Abel said quietly. Said it to my own children. It was Abel who counseled patience, who understood, better than Eli in his youth could, that a man like Silas Grigg would not simply confess to 15 years of quiet ruin, because a boy showed him an old ledger. Grigg had spent over a decade building a reputation as the town's steady hand, its most trusted arithmetic. He held mortgages on a dozen properties and sat on the church board and had, only that past autumn, been spoken of as a fit candidate for county commissioner. A boy's word against that would be laughed off the courthouse steps, the same steps where Eli had been laughed at for buying the Icehouse in the first place. Word travels in small towns the way water finds its way downhill, slowly, then all at once. Within a month, word had reached Grigg himself that the ransom boy had been seen hauling something heavy up from the old Icehouse pit, and that Abel Kestrel had been overheard in the tavern speaking Corliss Wexford's name in a tone that was anything but condemning. Grigg came to the Icehouse himself on a gray February afternoon, his fine coat entirely wrong for the walk down the frozen lake road, and found Eli splitting kindling outside the loft door. He was, as ever, gentle in his manner, complimenting the boy on his industry, remarking with apparent sympathy on how hard the winter had been for him, before working the conversation, with practiced patience, toward the subject of the pit, and what, precisely, a boy might find digging around in an old Icehouse foundation. Eli, who had inherited more of his father's careful nature than his open trust, said only that he'd found some old timber and broken tools, nothing of interest, and watched Grigg's pale eyes measure the lie and, apparently, decide not to press it. Not yet. But something had shifted, and Eli understood, walking back into the ice house that evening and bolting the door behind him for the first time since he'd bought the place, that he was no longer merely a poor orphan mending a ruin. He was, whether he wished it or not, in possession of the one thing that could undo Silas Grigg entirely. And Silas Grigg had not built 11 years of quiet power in Sable Hollow by allowing such things to remain hidden, or, Eli now feared, by allowing the people who held them to remain safe. The pressure came, over the following 2 weeks, in the particular slow, deniable way that men like Grigg preferred. The county assessor arrived unannounced to re-examine the Icehouse's tax valuation, hinting that a clerical review might find the boy owed considerably more than he'd paid. Abel Kestrel was visited by 2 of Grigg's associates from the trust, who mentioned, in passing, that the bank held a note on the forge's own lease, and that Abel would do well to mind whose business he minded. And one bitter night, someone, no one would ever say who, though Eli had his certainty, broke the Icehouse's outer doors and scattered the newly patched roof tin across the yard, a message delivered without a single word spoken. Eli moved the ledger and the strongbox that same night, wrapping them again in oilcloth and burying them, ironically, in the one place he now trusted completely, the deepest, coldest corner of the pit, beneath a fresh layer of packed snow, where Grigg's men, searching hastily 2 nights later while Eli slept at Kestrel's, found nothing at all. It was Abel who finally counseled the only course that could not be undone by threats or quiet pressure, to stop hiding the truth and instead give it to the whole town at once, in the open, where no single man's power could smother it. Sable Hollow held, every March, a town meeting in the church hall to settle the year's small business, road repairs, the school levy, the ordinary machinery of a community governing itself. And it was there, Abel argued, with every family in the hollow gathered under one roof, including, inevitably, Silas Grigg himself in his customary seat near the front, that the ledger ought to be read. Eli was 16 years old, orphaned, poorer than any man in that hall, and he stood at the front of the Sable Hollow church that March evening with his father's coat still hanging loose on his shoulders and his hands, for the first time in weeks, entirely steady. He did not speak long. He read from Corliss Wexford's ledger in the plain, unhurried voice his mother had taught him, letting the dead man's own careful hand tell the story that 15 years of assumption had buried, the refusal of the trust's offer, the followings on the ice road, the fear recorded in increasingly unsteady script, the cellar built alone over 2 winters beneath the one place no one would think to search. He set the strongbox itself on the table at the front of the hall and opened it, so that the gold and silver, dulled but whole, caught the lamplight and every eye in the room at once. He watched Silas Grigg's face through all of it, watched the practiced calm hold for the first several minutes, watched it begin, almost imperceptibly, to crack as the room's murmur shifted from confusion to a slow, dawning fury, watched a dozen farmers who had lost land to the trust's foreclosures over the past decade turn, as one body, to look at the banker in the front pew. Grigg tried, of course, to speak, to call it fabrication, to suggest the boy had forged the ledger himself for some obscure gain, to appeal to his own 11 years of respectability against the word of a dead man and an orphan. But the hall had, by then, remembered something the years of Grigg's smooth competence had let it forget, that Corliss Wexford had never, in all his life, given anyone reason to doubt him before that single vanished February, and that Silas Grigg's fortune, examined now in the sudden light of that ledger, had grown suspiciously, precisely, in step with every farm the trust had ever seized. Old Ephraim Doss, who had lost his own family's land to Grigg's mortgage 3 years before, stood up in the back of the hall and said, in a voice that carried to every corner, that he had never once, in 11 years, seen Silas Grigg do a kindness that didn't circle back to Silas Grigg's own pocket. And the murmur that followed was the sound of a town's long, uneasy trust finally, completely, breaking. There was no lynching, no violence. This was not that kind of story, and Sable Hollow was not that kind of town. But there was a reckoning, quiet and thorough in the way such things move through small communities. The county was called, records were subpoenaed, and within the month Silas Grigg had resigned his position at the trust and departed Sable Hollow entirely. His reputation, his only true asset, gone as completely as if it had been dropped through a hole in the ice. He was never formally imprisoned. The county attorney, examining 15-year-old evidence, could prove misconduct and manipulation, but not, conclusively, murder, but he left with nothing, which was, Abel Kestrel observed with grim satisfaction, roughly what he had spent 11 years leaving behind him and others. The schoolhouse fund, restored at last to the town's hands, was placed under the care of a committee that included, at the insistence of nearly every family present that March evening, Eli Ransom himself, not yet 17, the boy who had bought a worthless icehouse for $6 and found beneath its ice the truth the whole town had needed and never known to look for. Construction on the new schoolhouse began that same summer, on a rise above the lake road with windows enough to fill every room with light, and it was built, at Eli's quiet insistence, on land that included a small stone marker near the old ice-cutting grounds, engraved simply with Corliss Wexford's name and the words trusted, and found worthy of trust, a correction 15 years overdue. As for the Ransom farm, Eli did not have the means to reclaim it outright, but the county, in the wake of Griggs' exposed dealings, reviewed the foreclosure records of every family the trust had displaced and found, in more cases than anyone wished to count, that debts had been calculated with a generosity that always, curiously, favored the bank. Settlements were made. The Doss family got their land back that autumn. 2 other farms were similarly restored. Eli's own case was more complicated, his father's original debt having been genuine even if its collection had not been entirely honest, but the new bank that replaced Griggs' trust offered him, in recognition of what his ledger had uncovered for the whole town, a note so favorable that by the time he was 20, he stood once more on his father's 80 acres, working the same black soil, sleeping some nights still in the Icehouse loft out of a stubborn fondness for the place that had changed everything. We began this story with a boy standing in frozen mud, holding nothing but $7 and a grief with no bottom, watching a town laugh as he bought a ruin nobody wanted. We told you then that something sealed beneath that ice would change his life and heal a wound the whole town had learned to live with, and now you understand what that meant. Not treasure alone, though there was treasure, but truth, 15 winters preserved, waiting the way his father always said ice waited, for somebody patient enough to come looking. Eli Ransom did not buy an icehouse. He bought, for $6 and the price of being laughed at on a courthouse step, the chance to prove that value does not vanish simply because a town stops believing in it, and that a good man's name, like good ice packed carefully away, can be kept whole far longer than anyone thinks possible, if only someone is willing to dig. Thank you for spending this time with Eli's story and with us. If it moved you, we'd be grateful if you'd share it with someone who might need a reminder that overlooked things and overlooked people often hold more than the world gives them credit for. We'd love to hear from you in the comments. What is a time you found real value in something or someone that everyone else had already written off? Until next time, stay close.